He could not sleep with the lights off, and he had no explanation that satisfied him. At first, he assumed it was stress, something ordinary, something mechanical in the mind that could be traced back to work pressure or family strain. But the truth, as it often is, was not located in what he was doing during the day. It was located in what he had placed above his bed, where he spent his most vulnerable hours, and where his mind surrendered control every night without him realizing what that meant. A man in his mid-40s, a practicing Catholic, not someone unfamiliar with prayer or the sacraments, sat across from me, describing something he could not properly name. He was not describing fear in the emotional sense at first. He was describing a pattern, a consistent disturbance that grew in intensity over months, always returning at night when the room went dark. In pastoral work, one learns quickly that when a man insists the problem is everywhere except one specific detail he has stopped examining, that detail is usually where the truth is waiting. I asked him a simple question, the one question that tends to clarify more than any long conversation. I asked him what hung above his bed. He went silent immediately. Not because he did not know the answer, but because he suddenly understood that the answer mattered in a way he had not considered before. That silence is something I have encountered many times, and it usually marks the point where a person moves from interpretation to recognition, whether they want to or not. He eventually told me it was a mask. He had brought it home years earlier from a trip abroad, purchased in a marketplace that he described as being near a site where local religious practices were still carried out. It was carved from dark wood, elongated in form, with hollowed eyes and a fixed expression that was neither fully human nor entirely abstract. He had chosen it because it felt unique, because it looked like something meaningful, and because visitors often commented on it when they entered his home. For a long time, nothing seemed wrong. It simply hung there as decoration. But over time, something in the atmosphere of his home began to change in ways that were subtle at first. His prayer life, which had once been steady, became irregular. Confession, once routine, became occasional. Even small devotional habits disappeared without a dramatic decision to abandon them. They simply faded, as they often do when they are not deliberately maintained. It is important to understand something at this point, because otherwise the account becomes easy to misinterpret. I am not speaking in terms of superstition or emotional projection. I am speaking from years of pastoral and exorcistic experience within the Catholic tradition, where one learns to distinguish psychological disturbance from something more external in origin. The Church is cautious in these matters for good reason, but it is not ignorant of them. The man described the beginning of sensations that he could not explain. First came the sense of being observed at night, not in a dramatic or cinematic way, but as a persistent awareness that he was not alone in the dark. Then came the interruption of sleep itself. He would wake suddenly, without clear reason, with a strong internal certainty that something in the room was present and attentive. He also began to notice something else, something more physical in nature. The room developed a smell he could not eliminate, regardless of cleaning or ventilation. He described it as faintly like burned residue, mixed with dampness, a scent that intensified at night and diminished slightly during the day. Alongside this, there was a localized coldness that did not behave like normal airflow. It remained fixed in one area of the room, specifically on the side of the bed closest to the wall where the object hung. Over time, his behavior adjusted without conscious intention. He began sleeping farther away from that side of the bed. He avoided turning his attention toward the wall at night. His wife noticed changes but could not understand their origin. When asked, he had no coherent explanation he could offer her without sounding irrational, so he remained silent and endured it privately. What makes cases like this pastorally significant is not the surface phenomena themselves, but the convergence of details. A weakening of spiritual discipline, the presence of an object associated with non-Christian religious context, and the gradual intrusion of disturbances that increase precisely where the person is least defended, in the night, in sleep, in the quiet moments when the conscious will is no longer actively asserting control. At this stage, nothing has yet been interpreted in supernatural terms. We are still simply observing the account as it is given. But there is a point in these narratives where pattern becomes difficult to ignore, and where the question is no longer whether something is happening, but what the cause of it actually is. That is where the deeper tradition of the Church begins to speak. And that is where this case, like many others, becomes clearer rather than more obscure. When I continued speaking with him, what emerged was not a sudden event, but a slow progression that had taken place over months, almost without his awareness, until the situation had narrowed to a single focal point, the object on the wall above his bed, and the night he could no longer ignore it. What many people fail to understand is that the church has never taught that evil operates primarily through spectacle. The modern imagination expects something loud, obvious, and immediate. It imagines disturbances appearing all at once, accompanied by dramatic manifestations that leave no room for doubt. But the tradition, especially the tradition preserved by the saints and theologians, presents something far more unsettling. It presents an intelligence that is patient. To understand this, we must first understand what the Church actually teaches about fallen angels. St. Thomas Aquinas explains at great length that when an angel rebelled against God, it did not cease being an angel. The rebellion corrupted its will completely, directing it against God and everything ordered toward him, but it did not diminish the angel's natural abilities. Its intelligence remained vast, its memory remained intact, its capacity for observation remained extraordinary. This is where modern assumptions often fail. People imagine evil as something crude, almost clumsy, something that announces itself openly. But the Church has always described something different. A fallen angel remains an intellectual being. It studies, it observes, it waits, and because it does not experience fatigue the way human beings do, it can wait far longer than most people can imagine. A person is not equally strong at every moment of the day. There are times when reason is active, when prayer is deliberate, when the mind is focused and disciplined. But there are also moments when those defenses weaken. Sleep is one of those moments. During sleep, the conscious exercise of reason is reduced. The will is no longer directing attention with the same strength, yet the imagination continues to operate. The ancient fathers of the Church understood this very well. They regarded the imagination as a real faculty of the soul, a place where images are stored, combined, and presented to the mind. During waking hours, reason governs that faculty. During sleep, however, the imagination continues its activity with far less supervision. Images arise, memories blend together, thoughts move freely. The inner door stands more open than it does during the day. Scripture itself speaks plainly about spiritual vigilance. St. Peter warns believers that the adversary prowls like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. The image is not accidental. A lion does not attack a herd when every member is alert and standing together. It waits for isolation. It waits for vulnerability. It waits for the moment when resistance is weakest. That principle is important when considering the placement of certain objects within a home. An object is never merely a physical thing. Human beings assign meaning to objects constantly. We place photographs on walls because they remind us of people we love. We display religious images because they direct our attention toward God. Objects influence thought, memory, and imagination more than most people realize. When an object has been created specifically for a religious purpose outside the worship of God, the Church has traditionally viewed it differently than an ordinary decoration. It is not simply wood, stone, or metal. The material itself remains what it always was. But the object carries an orientation, a purpose, and a history tied to the use for which it was made. This distinction becomes essential because not every unusual event is the same. The Church has always distinguished carefully between various forms of spiritual disturbance. There are attacks upon the imagination. There are attacks upon the senses. There are forms of oppression and obsession. Then there is possession, which is far rarer and far more serious. Confusing these categories leads people either to dismiss real problems or exaggerate ordinary ones. In the case of this man, nothing suggested possession. What he was experiencing aligned much more closely with what spiritual writers have historically called obsession, an external pressure exerted upon the imagination and senses. The disturbances centered around fear, perception, atmosphere, and persistent psychological harassment. The key point was that all of these experiences appeared connected to a specific foothold. The Church has long recognized that certain objects can function as such footholds. Throughout history, Missionaries entering newly converted regions frequently encountered items associated with pagan worship. The response was remarkably consistent. These objects were not preserved as interesting cultural decorations. They were removed. Often they were destroyed. This was not because the church feared wood or stone. It was because the church understood what those objects represented. An object made for the worship of something other than God carries that purpose within its identity. It was fashioned for a specific spiritual orientation. When brought into a Christian home and given a place of prominence, particularly in places of vulnerability and intimacy, it can create circumstances that are spiritually unhealthy. The old exorcists understood this instinctively because they encountered such situations repeatedly. The older Roman ritual reflected this understanding. For centuries, when investigating spiritual disturbances, one of the first practical steps was the examination and removal of questionable objects. It was considered obvious. Before lengthy investigations, before elaborate prayers, before any extraordinary measures, attention was directed toward what had been allowed into the home. The reasoning was simple. If a door has been opened, one closes the door before doing anything else. The saints themselves provide striking examples of spiritual attacks occurring during the night. Consider the curé of Ars, a humble parish priest whose life was marked by extraordinary holiness. For years, he endured disturbances that often occurred while he was trying to rest. He referred to the source of these disturbances with almost weary familiarity, not because he enjoyed speaking about them, but because they became a recurring part of his ministry. The same pattern appears in the life of Padre Pio. Few figures in modern Catholic history displayed greater spiritual strength, yet even he wrote about nocturnal attacks and struggles that left visible effects. These were not weak men. They were not unstable men. They were among the strongest spiritual figures the Church has produced. Yet the attacks often came during the hours of darkness, when human defenses are naturally reduced. That reality should not lead to fear. It should lead to clarity. If those dedicated entirely to God experience spiritual opposition, then ordinary people should not be surprised when they encounter lesser forms of it. The real question is not whether spiritual warfare exists. The real question is whether a person recognizes the openings through which such warfare often begins. For the man sitting across from me, that question was about to become impossible to avoid, because the evidence he himself had already witnessed pointed toward a conclusion he had resisted accepting, and the moment he finally admitted what had happened the week before, the entire case suddenly became much easier to understand. The turning point in cases like this is rarely dramatic in the way people expect. It is not a sudden revelation accompanied by unmistakable signs. More often, it is a quiet moment when a person remembers something they had already noticed, but chose not to interpret too deeply. In this man's case, that moment came when he described a simple action he had taken without thinking much of it at the time. He told me that some weeks earlier he had removed the object from the wall while repainting his bedroom. For a short time, it had not been hanging above his bed. He had placed it face down on the mattress, intending only to move it temporarily. What he described next was not emotional speculation, but a clear observation he had not fully processed until later. During that period, the atmosphere of the room changed. The smell he had grown accustomed to disappeared. The sense of coldness in a specific area of the bed was gone. Most importantly, he slept through the night without waking in the same anxious state. For the first time in months, rest came naturally, without effort or fear. At the time, he did not connect these changes to the object. Human beings tend to normalize relief just as easily as they normalize distress. When something improves, we often assume it is coincidence or timing rather than cause and effect. So he placed the object back on the wall once the painting was finished, mostly because the space looked empty without it. He admitted this to me with visible hesitation, as though he were recounting a decision he now understood differently. And it was at this point that the pattern became unmistakable. The disturbances did not simply coincide with the presence of the object. They diminished in its absence and returned when it was restored to its place above the bed. When I spoke to him about what needed to be done, I did not speak in symbolic terms. I told him directly that the object had to be removed, not stored away, not moved to another room, not given to someone else. It needed to be destroyed. This is not a suggestion based on superstition, but a practical response grounded in how the Church has historically treated objects associated with spiritual contamination. His resistance was immediate, though not aggressive. It was the kind of resistance that arises when a person feels they are being asked to act against their own sense of reason. He argued that the object was simply decorative, that it had artistic value, and that destroying it felt irrational. These are common responses, and they are worth paying attention to, because they reveal how strongly attachment can form even when a person believes they are acting objectively. But there was another detail that weakened his own argument. He recalled again what had happened during the time the object was off the wall. The room had been normal. He had rested in a way he had not been able to for months. There was no smell, no sense of presence, no disruption of sleep. He himself admitted that this could not easily be dismissed. That realization created a moment of internal conflict. On one side was his desire to treat the object as harmless. On the other was his direct experience of change depending on its presence or absence. It is in moments like this that clarity begins to form, not through external persuasion, but through the collapse of internal inconsistency. Eventually, he agreed to remove it that night. What followed was not theatrical, but it was deeply revealing in its simplicity. He described how difficult it was to take it down, not because of physical difficulty, but because of hesitation that seemed to arise each time he reached for it. He had to make a deliberate effort to proceed, step by step, until it was finally detached from the wall. When the hook came out, it left a small mark in the plaster. He told me he avoided looking at that mark afterward, as though it represented something he did not want to think about too directly. The object itself he wrapped carefully, still unsure what to do next, until he was instructed to dispose of it properly. It was then broken and burned, following a form of destruction consistent with long-standing pastoral practice in similar cases. After this was done, something important changed, but again, not in a dramatic or immediate way. The room did not transform into something extraordinary. There were no sudden sensations or visible signs. Instead, what returned was absence. The smell did not come back. The coldness did not reappear in the bed. The sense of being observed at night stopped. He began to sleep in the dark again. It is important to be precise here. The Church does not teach that wood or material objects possess inherent power in themselves. What is being described is not a property of matter, but the relationship between intention, use, and spiritual vulnerability. Objects can become associated with spiritual influence depending on how and where they are introduced into a person's life, especially when that person's spiritual defenses have already weakened. In this case, the removal of the object coincided with the cessation of the disturbances. From a pastoral perspective, that correlation is significant. It is not presented as superstition, but as observation repeated across many similar cases. Once the immediate issue was resolved, the next step was restoration. The room was blessed by a priest. A crucifix that had been properly blessed was placed where the object had once hung. An image of the Blessed Virgin Mary was added nearby, reflecting the traditional understanding of spiritual protection within the home. Holy water was restored and used regularly, particularly at entry points and in sleeping areas. The man also returned to the sacraments in a more disciplined way. Confession, which had previously become irregular, was resumed. The Eucharist was received in a state of grace, with renewed seriousness. These are not secondary details. In Catholic understanding, they are central to restoring spiritual order, because they reestablish the proper orientation of the soul toward God. What stands out in cases like this is not only the resolution of distress, but the way in which clarity returns alongside it. The environment becomes normal again, but more importantly, the person's interpretation of reality becomes stable. Fear is replaced not with emotional excitement, but with peace grounded in order. For him, the conclusion was simple, though not easily forgotten. Something had entered his life gradually, not through spectacle, but through neglect of practices he once considered ordinary. And when those practices were restored, the disturbance lost its foothold. The significance of this is not meant to be exaggerated, it is meant to be understood in context. The Church does not encourage obsession with hidden forces. It encourages vigilance, discipline, and the use of ordinary means of grace. When those means are neglected, vulnerability increases. when they are restored, stability returns. This case, like many others, ends not with fear, but with correction. And in the next part, we will examine what this reveals about the threshold of the home itself, and why the boundary between inside and outside matters more than most people realize. What follows in this kind of situation is often misunderstood because people expect the lesson to be about fear, when in reality, it is about order. The Church has never approached spiritual reality as something chaotic or random. It has always insisted that there is structure, hierarchy, and boundary. When that order is disrupted in small, almost unnoticed ways, the effects can appear gradually in the life of a person and even within the home itself. The man's case did not end with the removal of a single object. That removal was only the correction of a specific point of entry. What mattered next was whether his home would remain spiritually disordered or whether it would be reestablished in a way that reflected its intended purpose. In Catholic understanding, a home is not just a private space. It is a place meant to be oriented toward God, and that orientation is not symbolic. It is expressed through concrete practices. After the object was removed, attention turned to what had been absent for some time. The first and most basic element was the visible presence of Christ within the home. A crucifix that had been properly blessed was placed in the room where the disturbance had centered. This is not treated as decoration. It is treated as a declaration of alignment, a reminder of authority and identity placed directly within the space where vulnerability had previously been experienced. Alongside this, an image of the Blessed Virgin Mary was introduced. In the tradition of the Church, her presence is not viewed sentimentally, but theologically. She represents obedience, purity, and protection under grace. Her role in spiritual tradition is consistently described as opposed to disorder and deception, not through force, but through complete alignment with God's will. Holy water was also reintroduced into the home, particularly at entry points. This practice is often dismissed in modern times as symbolic, but within the Church's sacramental theology, sacramentals are not empty gestures. They are prayers made tangible, extending the Church's intercession into physical spaces. The consistent use of holy water at thresholds reflects the understanding that a home has boundaries that should be intentionally marked. But beyond objects and practices, the most important restoration was sacramental life itself. The man returned to confession in a serious and consistent way. This is significant because confession, in Catholic theology, is not simply psychological relief. It is the direct removal of sin through the authority Christ gave to the Church. In that sense, it is understood as the clearing of ground that had been occupied. The Eucharist followed naturally from this. Received in a state of grace, it is considered the central act of union with Christ. In the theological framework of the Church, there is no greater protection than a life regularly sustained by this sacrament, not because it is treated as a ritual safeguard, but because it is understood as participation in divine life itself. Once these elements were restored, something noticeable occurred. Though it was not immediate or dramatic, the disturbances did not return. There were no further reports of cold spots, unexplained sensations, or sleep interruptions. More importantly, the atmosphere of the home stabilized in a way that the man himself recognized as normal for the first time in months. It is important not to misunderstand what this implies. The Church does not claim that every difficulty in a home is spiritual in origin, nor does it suggest that physical reality is unstable or unpredictable. What it does teach is that human beings are composite beings, both physical and spiritual, and that neglect in one dimension often affects the other in ways that are not always obvious at first. This brings us to a point that is often overlooked in modern discussions. The threshold of a home is not merely architectural. It is symbolic of a boundary between the outside world and the intimate space of life, rest, and vulnerability. Historically, many Christian households treated the entrance of the home with deliberate care, marking it with prayer, blessing, or visible signs of faith. The reason for this is not superstition, but recognition. Human beings are influenced by what they repeatedly encounter. The home shapes the mind over time. What is placed within it becomes part of its atmosphere, not in a mystical sense of constant supernatural activity, but in the very real psychological and spiritual influence that environment exerts on a person. When that environment is filled with disorder, ambiguity, or objects whose meaning is unclear or contrary to Christian understanding, The result is not always immediate disruption. More often, it is gradual weakening of attention, discipline, and interior stability. This is how most forms of spiritual vulnerability begin in traditional accounts. Not through dramatic intrusion, but through small omissions that accumulate. In this man's case, the threshold of his home had not been guarded in that sense. Objects had entered without discernment. Practices had faded without replacement. Devotion had diminished, not through rejection, but through neglect. And into that space, disturbances found opportunity to develop influence over his imagination, particularly during the hours when he was least able to defend himself consciously. The correction, then, was not only about removing a single object, it was about restoring boundaries that had become blurred. Once those boundaries were re-established, the influence ceased. From a pastoral perspective, this is not unusual. It reflects a consistent pattern observed in similar cases over time. The Church has always emphasized that spiritual life is not sustained by extraordinary interventions, but by ordinary fidelity. Prayer, sacrament, moral discipline, and the sanctification of the home are not secondary practices. They are the structure that supports stability. When they are present, disturbances have less ground to take hold. When they are absent, even small openings can become significant over time. What this case ultimately demonstrates is not a world filled with constant hidden threats, but a world in which order matters. The difference between peace and unrest is often not found in dramatic moments, but in whether the basic structure of spiritual life has been maintained. In the final part, we will look at what this reveals more broadly about how homes become spiritually stable again, and why the Church insists that authority, not fear, is the proper foundation for confronting these situations. The final lesson in this case is not about fear, and it is not about focusing excessively on unseen disturbances. It is about authority, rightly understood and properly exercised. The Church has never approached spiritual conflict as something resolved through anxiety or constant attention to the possibility of evil. Instead, it has always taught that stability comes from alignment with what is good, ordered, and established by Christ. When everything in the man's home was corrected, the result was not a dramatic confrontation, but a return to normal life. That is an important detail that should not be overlooked. There were no extraordinary manifestations after the correction. There was simply the absence of what had previously disturbed him. The room became quiet in the most ordinary sense of the word. Sleep returned. Rest became natural again. The mind stopped reacting to what it had previously interpreted as presence or pressure. From a pastoral perspective, this is often how resolution appears. It does not always announce itself. It is recognized in hindsight through stability rather than spectacle. What changed was not the environment in a visible sense, but the absence of interference that had been affecting his perception and rest. The Church explains this not in terms of superstition, but in terms of order and authority. Christ's authority, as understood in Catholic theology, is not symbolic. It is actual and operative through the means he established, the sacraments, the ministry of the Church, and the life of grace. When these are present and actively lived, they are understood as establishing a rightly ordered space within the life of a believer. In this case, the most significant shift was not the removal of the object alone, but the restoration of sacramental life. Confession reintroduced honesty before God in a structured and objective way, not merely as personal reflection, but as reconciliation. The Eucharist recentered his life around Christ in a way that is understood as sustaining grace. These are not secondary practices in Catholic understanding, they are foundational. Alongside this, the re-establishment of visible signs of faith within the home played an important role. The crucifix, the image of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and the use of holy water were not treated as symbolic decorations, but as reminders of belonging and orientation. They marked the home as intentionally ordered toward God, which in the Church's view is not abstract, but real in its effect on how a person lives and perceives their environment. What this case ultimately shows is not that fear should govern how people think about their homes, but that neglect creates vulnerability in ways people often do not recognize until after the fact. The disturbances described by the man did not arise in a single moment. They developed gradually, alongside a fading of practices that once structured his spiritual life. It is also important to be clear about what this does not mean. The Church does not teach that every difficulty, fear, or unusual experience is the result of external spiritual influence. Human psychology, stress, and ordinary life pressures explain most experiences people struggle with. Discernment is always necessary, and caution is always required before drawing conclusions. However, the tradition also acknowledges that there are cases where spiritual factors intersect with human experience in ways that cannot be reduced simply to psychology alone. In such cases, the response is never improvisation or panic. It is always the same consistent pattern: return to the sacraments, restore prayer, remove what is inappropriate, and re-establish the order of the home under Christ. The most important principle in all of this is authority. Not human authority as control or dominance, but divine authority as participation in the order Christ established. The Church acts within that authority, not independently of it. That is why its responses are structured, consistent, and grounded in practices that have remained unchanged in their essence for centuries. For the man in this case, the outcome was simple but profound. His home returned to peace, and his nights returned to rest. What had disrupted him lost its influence once the conditions that allowed it were corrected. There was no need for constant attention to the experience afterward. In fact, continuing to focus on it would have missed the point entirely. The point is that spiritual stability is not maintained by vigilance rooted in fear, but by fidelity rooted in practice. When a life is ordered around prayer, sacrament, and the presence of Christ, it is not easily unsettled. When those elements are absent or neglected, even small openings can become points of disturbance over time. This is why the Church consistently directs attention not toward fascination with hidden forces, but toward the ordinary means of grace. These are not presented as optional enhancements to spiritual life. They are presented as the structure that supports it. In the end, the lesson of this case is not about a haunted room or a mysterious object. It is about what happens when spiritual order is weakened and what restores it again. And the answer, according to the tradition, has always been the same: return to Christ, return to the sacraments, and restore what has been neglected.